We've won the war, and every colonizer state except the United States has either been destroyed or severely weakened, leaving the US at the reins of global culture like never before. At the same time, the jazz scene has exploded in creativity, taking a deep dive into experimentation that has potentially sabotaged its chart position as the world tunes into R&B and rock and roll instead. While the white middle-class winners of the post-war economy were living on easy street, Harlem was already seeing the post-war malaise which would dominate all of New York City by the late 1970s. This was one of the most culturally conservative moments in modern American history, and at the time experimental bebop jazz largely fell on deaf ears. But the scene, the musicians it influenced, and its other allies in the New York creative community were about to take the nation's culture production by storm. This week, we're moving our jazz conversation into the inspiring individual world of bebop, a movement we'll summarize today through one of its most popular and enduring products, Sonny Side Up by Dizzy Gillespie, Sonny Stitt, and Sonny Rollins. If you've heard of the beat generation of writers and artists in New York City in the late 40s and early 50s, bebop largely developed alongside that community. In those early days, bebop won over a small group of intensely loyal fans through its performances at after-hours clubs and other underground venues. From these early days, bebop was already known for pushing extreme tempos and highlighting lengthy virtuosic solos that huge jazz fans could not get enough of. Though bebop was always subversive, it wasn't initially seen as a complete rejection of the popular swing style, more instead as an outgrowth of it. You can really feel this continuity in Gillespie's style in particular, as he keeps that swing feel even at bebop's extreme speeds. But this adherence to tradition didn't keep bebop from being seen as culturally dangerous, especially as many of its main practitioners were heroin addicts, because anyone who was anyone in New York was a heroin addict. From early on, bebop had an obsession with what are called 2/5 sequences in its chord progressions. You don't need to know what that means, but essentially it makes it sound like the music is constantly shifting between keys and between major and minor feels. These 2/5 sequences were set up in a way to slowly stair-step down between points on the already established 12-bar blues. It makes the music constantly have a set of trajectory, and it adds a ton of complexity to that formula that had existed for jazz for generations. This harmonic sensibility melded perfectly with bebop's obsession with speed, and it gives context to all of those iconic moments where soloists rip through a descending melody that feels like it could go on forever. Now, of the personnel on this record, Dizzy Gillespie's name probably carries the furthest. Gillespie is a legendary co-founder of the bebop sound alongside Charlie Parker, who was the key influence on Stitt and Rollins. Gillespie was always known for his extremely varied soloing style. He was able to pull away with these breakneck melodic runs before abruptly stopping to let a shock of air into the composition. Now, of course, Gillespie always meant for his work to be taken seriously, but he wasn't afraid to show a sense of humor in his live shows, or even in the occasional whimsical move in his solos. It's also worth noting that by the time Sonny Side Up came around, Gillespie was almost exclusively playing these weird-looking bent trumpets. They came about because somebody accidentally fell on his trumpet once and bent it, and he loved the sound so much that he had these things custom-made for him from then on. Stitt and Rollins were seen as representing two different parts of Charlie Parker's personality in their saxophone playing. Stitt was more concerned with the pure intensity of bebop, while Rollins was always a bit more conceptual. You can actually make a historical argument that Stitt developed his style concurrently with and in complete isolation from Charlie Parker, making his playing just as unique and original. And Rollins' main calling card was implementing themes from other jazz standards or from elsewhere within the same standard into his solos. Rollins also always seemed a bit more interested in rhythmic diversity than rhythmic intensity, and he was often said to be improvising on the rhythm in the same way that most musicians were improvising on the melody. Now on to the content of the album itself. In classic jazz fashion, the only one of these four songs that was written for this album originally is The Eternal Triangle by Sonny Stitt. All three of the other standards on the album weren't actually originally written in the bebop style, and particularly the song I Know That You Know was already considered a bit old and safe by this point. All it takes is a quick glance at the track lengths and you can tell these jazz standards have been thoroughly reworked. On the Sunny Side of the Street retools a very safe standard with the most accessible version of some of bebop's deepest obsessions, like that 2/5 progression and chromatic progressions. But the track does a great job of sticking to bebop's creative ambitions instead of compromising on them. Of particular note here is the third solo from Rollins. It provides an immediate change of pace and shows his obsession with repeating themes, and these themes gain different contexts as the chords shift below them, and at times the themes even have to move chromatically to keep up with the movement of the chords. The Eternal Triangle, and especially I Know That You Know, are built almost entirely of those wandering 2/5 progressions, and they provide excellent examples of how this trope sounds in action. On The Eternal Triangle, I want to call attention to two solos in particular, the second solo by Stitt and the third solo by Gillespie. Stitt's solo is so erratic that it's almost impossible to trace the trajectory of the chords moving below, but he lines right back up with that harmony every time it counts. The absolute chaos of this solo makes all the more sense when you think of this song as a duel between the two saxophonists, and it makes sense since Stitt was going second and he needed to hit back hard. And Gillespie's solo here gives you an excellent understanding of his perfect use of pacing. We feel like we're being told a story here, and his use of silence feels like natural punctuation in a spoken sentence. On I Know That You Know, I would pay attention to the second solo from Gillespie especially. Gillespie attacks with an absolute vengeance here, like somebody's gonna rip his trumpet out of his hand if he doesn't hit a certain number of notes in a certain time, and it just shows his virtuosity that other moments on this album that are more tempered might not. After Hours is by far the most harmonically basic track on the album, and you can almost be forgiven from partially divorcing it from the bebop context. After Hours mostly sticks to something close to the 12-bar blues, although it does have a stubborn insistence on the major 6 chord, a chord which gives songs a melancholy and warm feel that you actually see a lot in pop music. The song rhythmically operates in a triplet meter instead of the standard 4/4, but it makes up for that added rhythmic complexity with a vastly reduced speed. In particular here, I'll call attention to the second solo by Rollins. You could almost cut and paste a good chunk of the first few bars of this thing into its own pop melody, and it would be perfectly serviceable there. This shows a very clear example of his theme building process from a much more nonchalant, laid-back perspective. Throughout this album, we see the extreme individual expression afforded by bebop, allowing artists to put just about anything into their work, and for us to take just about anything out of it. With the solidification of the swing style and jazz as pop music in the 1930s, jazz needed a jolt of energy, as this formerly insurgent genre had become safe and predictable with its own set of intense rules. This album also showcases a beautiful, ideal creative rivalry between Stitt and Rollins, bringing all that you have to the table and creating something together that neither of you would have made on your own. Through its wildly energetic, almost manic presentation, bebop exists as its own kind of struggle music, showing glimpses of that melancholic nature of blues while harmonizing with the sugar rush of American global domination and capitalist acceleration. Even in its most careless and least self-aware moments, America still had a soul, one struggling for visibility from within a hyperactive culture, but one that American artists were always going to expose and showcase no matter what.